Okay, great. Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome to the Environmental Research 2023 virtual event focused on climate change and the terrestrial carbon cycle. It's my honor to introduce our five world-renowned experts in this field, and please join me in welcoming them. They are Professor Yanlan Liu from the Ohio State University, Professor Pierre Gentine from Columbia University, and Professor Kim Novick from Indiana University, and Professor Rong from UCLA, and our last plenary speaker, Dr. Dave Schimel from JPL. Because Professor Rongfu and Dr. Dave Schimel are in Western Coast, it's pretty early for them. Not sure if they are here yet. Today we are going to have five diverse talks, which will cover a full spectrum of the terrestrial carbon cycle and its interaction with climate change, starting from the high latitude, and then later on we are going to have talks on tropical rainforest, and then at the larger scale, focusing on water stress, and then climate solutions. Our first speaker is Professor Yanlan Liu. Yanlan is an eco-hydrologist interested in how plant-water climate interactions shape current and future ecosystem dynamics. She got her PhD from environmental science and a master degree in statistics from Duke University. And then she joined Stanford University and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab as a postdoc before she started her assistant professorship in Ohio State University. Her research focuses on vegetation dynamics and climate feedbacks in water-stressed, fast-warming, and fire-disturbed ecosystems. She investigates related science questions by integrating dynamic theories, numerical models from site to the global scale, and remote sensing measurements. So the floor is yours, Yanlan. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction, Ying. Thank you everyone for joining me at this talk. I'd like to use the next half an hour to bring you to the cold northern high latitudes and think about vegetation dynamics in those regions. So the northern high latitudes are warming up at really fast rate. In the Arctic, it's estimated as 4 times as fast as the rest of the globe. And this fast warming trend is expected to continue under future climate, as you can see in the left panel. This kind of fast warming can induce a bunch of diverse set of ecosystem responses, ranging from permafrost thaw, shift microbe activities, changing ecological and physiological dynamics, and disturbances such as fires and thaw slumps. So these manifested ecosystem processes could shift terrestrial carbon budget. Indeed, a set of Earth system models predict consistent increase of net biome production, as you can see, till the mid of this century. This increase is primarily due to increasing CO2 concentration and warming temperature. But in fact, this kind of related projection is highly uncertain. What we are looking at in the right panel is the projected change of net primary productivity and change of carbon storage in vegetation for global and Arctic boreal regions. We can see that, yes, the Arctic boreal regions are expecting large increase in NPP and carbon storage, but the uncertainty itself, represented by the black vertical line here, is 3 times as large as the global average shown by the green bar. So constraining the uncertainty in Arctic boreal region carbon budget could effectively contribute to constraining global carbon budget. And in fact, this uncertainty largely originates from vegetation change. Over the recent decades, satellites have observed widespread vegetation changes, such as widespread evergreen forest loss and the shrub gain in the Arctic region. Also, in areas that did not experience land cover change, we also observe persistent trends, such as the greening trend in the Arctic. So to understand what future Arctic boreal carbon budget will look like, we first need to understand or quantify how vegetation is changing, especially from different perspectives. So as examples, I like to bring your attention to two specific topics that contribute to address this big question. The first aspect is about what controls Arctic shrub expansion pattern, where they would grow in the future climate. And second is we will be looking at Arctic boreal vegetation resilience. Essentially, resilience tells us how fast the ecosystem can recover back from perturbations before crossing a tipping point, such as forest loss. So let's start from the first one. The left panels show an example of Arctic shrub expansion. On the top figure, we see an old image taken in 1948. We see near the river, there was no shrubs, but then 50 years later, at the same location, another image showed that a bunch of shrubs established in that region. So this new recruitment of shrub land is actually pretty pervasive across the entire Arctic region. In the right panel, we are showing the new shrub area over 1984 to 2014. The bright colors show the region similar to what we see in the left panel, where lots of grubs established. And this domain shows Alaska and Western Canada. So as you can see, this shrub expansion pattern is very spatially heterogeneous. They could establish in some regions, but other regions, the establishment rate is really low. So we need to understand where they had established over this 30-year period and how they will continue to expand under future climate. So first thing, to explore where shrubs would expand, we first put together climate and topographic conditions to build the classic species distribution models to estimate the suitability in 1984, and we constrained the model using what we observed in 1984 when the climate was relatively stable. So with this species distribution model, we were able to explain a high fraction of variability over shrub cover using suitability alone. So just to show you what environmental factors are the most important in explaining shrub cover, we find it's mostly temperature measured by the degree days above 5 degrees Celsius, elevation, snow, and annual heat moisture index. So spatially, we can explain the shrub cover using suitability as a function of climate conditions and topographic conditions. You can see that the bright colors correspond with each other pretty well from the left and right. So as the climate warmed up from 1984 to 2014, we are seeing increasing suitability. Okay? Climates are becoming more suitable for shrubs to grow, especially in the southwestern Alaska. But if we look at where shrubs established during that period, it's actually not following the spatial pattern of increasing suitability. So you can see on the lower left panel, the suitability increased a lot, the lower left region of this domain. You can see suitability increased a lot, but not new shrub area. So that means although we can use climate conditions to explain shrub cover back in 1984, that relationship would collapse when we explain new shrub area. So climate and topography alone cannot explain where shrubs would grow. Okay? So that means something else must explain this pattern. So we went back to the original ecological processes and think about what are the other options. So shrub expansion basically originates from seed dispersal. So seeds have to arrive at a given place and then it can establish and grow. We used the distance-based kernel to estimate the seed arrival probability. It measures the spatial proximity of a given location to existing shrub patches. The higher the value, the closer it is spatially to existing shrub patches. And we use both short and long distance dispersal to capture the two different mechanisms. And then we use the seed arrival probability as another variable to explain the shrub expansion pattern. So this is what we get. We're looking at the sensitivity of shrub expansion with respect to suitability, long and short distance dispersal in panel A. And the blue bars show the sensitivity in areas that did not get disturbed by fire. So we can see that shrub expansion is actually 7 times more sensitive to short distance dispersal than to suitability. So if a location is very close to existing shrub patches, those are the locations that are most likely to experience shrub gain. Comparing areas disturbed and undisturbed by fires, we can see that fire disturbance shown in red promoted shrub expansion. So overall, when an area is disturbed by fire and if it's close to existing shrub patches, that's where we are most likely to detect new shrub expansion. So overall, shrubs did not expand to all the new suitable areas, but instead were limited by fire and dispersal. So considering all these impacts, we did a bit extrapolation and predict where the new shrubs would grow by the end of the century. So overall, we can see that shrubs would establish in areas close to existing shrub patches, similar to shrubline advancement. Overall, we can see that about a quarter of the domain will be dominated by shrubs. But this is not the whole picture. This statistical prediction neglects lots of demographic dynamics and the fine-scale interaction with climate. But the point is, if we compare this prediction with a traditional prediction where we assume that vegetation follows a stable relationship with climate, we would actually get a lower fraction of shrub expansion. So when we neglect dispersal and fire, the estimation will be overestimated to 39%, and therefore expectedly the carbon sink will be overestimated. So future work needs to better represent dispersal and fire vegetation feedbacks in order to improve the prediction of Arctic shrub expansion. Like I said, this is an estimation of the trend of vegetation change, and it simplified lots of dynamics, including the response to climate perturbations and recovery post-disturbances. So next, I will switch the gear a little bit to bring your attention to our second research question, which is how has Arctic boreal vegetation resilience changed? Again, resilience tells us the capability of an ecosystem to bounce back from perturbation before crossing the tipping point, such as the transition from a forest state to a non-forest state. To give you a little bit more context, this area, the Arctic boreal regions, are experiencing lots of disturbances such as fires, insects, and logging. So these disturbances are causing lots of vegetation change. In order to predict vegetation changes under future climate, essentially we need to know when and where vegetation becomes vulnerable to climate and disturbances, and essentially how fast they can recover back afterwards. This is consistent with most demographic processes, but what's special about Arctic boreal region is that the recovery rate post-disturbance is very diverse. Here in the left panel, we're looking at the post-fire shrub recovery along the gradient of environmental suitability. We can see that for the environment that is suitable for shrub growth, the post-fire recovery can be as low as close to 0% or as high as 80%. So there's lots of high variability in the resilience. Similarly, for the boreal forest, field survey data showed that across the regions, there could be full recovery as shown by those blue bars and some sort of failed recovery shown by the brown bars. So this diversity of resilience across space requires us to quantify the resilience at a large scale and understand what controls them. So before we do that, we need to define resilience more clearly. Okay? So there are multiple measures that are commonly used to measure resilience, and one of them is the time to recovery. Here I'm showing two examples for illustration. On the left, we see that the system state, like the greenness of the vegetation, suddenly dropped and then gradually recovered back. And this recovery rate is, the time to recovery is very short in contrast to what we see on the right. So we would say the left case has a higher resilience than the right case. By saying that, we are actually using the time it takes to recover to the pre-loss state as a measure of resilience. This is one of the most commonly used measure in ecological studies. But here I like to highlight another measure for resilience. When we zoom into two adjacent system state, we can see that on the left, the two states are very different in a way that they show low self-similarity between t and t+1, in contrast to the right panel where we see very similar system states. So if we calculate the autocorrelation over time, we will see low autocorrelation on the left, the high resilience scenario, and high autocorrelation on the right, the low resilience scenario. So in this case, we can use the temporal lag 1 autocorrelation to measure resilience. So this measure of resilience does not require the actual occurrence of a dip in order to measure the time, the rate of recovery. Okay. Again, high autocorrelation means low resilience. This approach is actually not new. Many studies have applied this measure of autocorrelation to diagnose how the resilience has changed under future climate. So in this panel, this figure, we are seeing reduced resilience as represented by the brown colors and enhanced resilience represented by the green colors. But in this analysis, we can see there's a huge gap in the northern high latitudes, partially because of lack of sufficient data, remote sensing data for vegetation state. And given that the high latitudes are experiencing such fast warming rate and disturbances, we need to remove these confounding factors before we talked about resilience change. So to fill this gap, we tested using the negative autocorrelation as a measure of resilience, okay? And then here on the top panel, I'm showing you two examples of vegetation greenness EVI on the y-axis over time from 2000 to 2020. So both of these pixels are showing a greening trend, which is very common across that region. But when we apply fit this time series into a statistical model to disentangle the autocorrelation signal, we can see that on the left panel, the resilience is actually increasing in contrast to the decreasing resilience on the right. This trend comes from the high frequency variation in the original time series, which is hard to decipher by eyeballing the original time series. But the point is, the trend of resilience may be different from the greening trend. And the grad student Yue Zhang in my group applied this method across the Arctic boreal region in North America. And we found that resilience reduced in most boreal forests, shown by the red colors, and increased in Arctic tundra, shown in the blue colors. So we see this clear gradient across the latitudes, so reducing resilience in lower latitudes. And if we draw the statistics over space, we see that about 45% of the regions experienced reduced resilience. What's interesting is that if we focus on the regions that experienced reduced resilience, we can see that some of them showed browning trend, meaning that the vegetation cover is reducing, but there are also significant portion where the trend of greenness is increasing, but the resilience has been reduced. Okay? So that means resilience and greening are not the same thing, and greening does not always enhance resilience. So next, we'd like to understand what controls the spatial pattern of this decreasing versus reducing resilience. So we used a random forest model to find out what factors explain the increasing or decreasing of resilience the most. And the most important factors we found are the summer temperature, active layer thickness. Basically, both of them represent how warm the above ground is and how warm the below ground is. Other factors include the elevation, how dense the vegetation is, measured by summer EVI, as well as some moisture variables. So let's take a look at how each of these factors affect resilience trend. So in these two panels, we're looking at how the probability of reduced resilience, shown by the red band, changes with a gradient of the variable, such as summer temperature and active layer thickness. We see that in warmer regions, higher summer temperature, higher active layer thickness, the probability of reduced resilience increased. That means resilience was more likely to reduce in warmer regions. Similarly, across the gradient of elevation and summer EVI, higher elevation, denser vegetation also increases the likelihood of reduced resilience. Focusing on the moisture supply, we can see that for drier locations with lower precipitation as snow and higher summer climate moisture deficit, those are also the regions that are more likely to experience reduced resilience. Additionally, faster warming rate of summer temperature and lower soil nitrogen content also could promote the likelihood of reduced resilience. So overall, resilience was more likely to reduce in warmer, higher, drier regions. Apart from the long-term change of the resilience, given that the Arctic boreal region is experiencing lots of land cover changes such as forest loss and fires, we specifically zoom in those areas to see how resilience changed before and after those changes. For example, here, focusing on the areas that experienced forest loss, we calculated the fraction of reduced resilience on the y-axis for evergreen forest loss and deciduous forest loss. A value higher than 0.5 means a higher likelihood of resilience reduction in forest loss areas compared to control areas. Blue to red colors represent 5 years before and 5 years after. So what we are seeing is that before the forest loss, we can already detect a high likelihood of reduced resilience, and that gives us some early warning for the forthcoming forest loss. Interestingly, after forest loss, we see slow recovery as represented by this high fraction of reduced resilience. That means 5 years after the forest loss, the recovery still remained low. This pattern actually shows a latitudinal pattern. In fact, the fraction of reduced resilience is the highest in the lower latitude, the southern edge of the boreal forest. Then let's zoom in to look at the resilience post-fires across the land cover types. We can see that after most of these fires occurred across the land cover types, the resilience stayed consistently low 5 years after fires. And this fraction is the highest in forests than non-forest, meaning that it's more difficult for forests to recover post-fires. So although we are seeing variability across land covers and the specific forest loss types, we found that land cover change and fires were frequently accompanied by reduced resilience. So that tells us that these kind of abrupt changes are contributing to reduced resilience. So collectively, what I hope you'd take away with you after this talk is that vegetation changes such as shrub expansion are probably not in pace with fast warming in Arctic boreal regions. From a resilience perspective, resilience has been reduced, especially in the warm edge of the boreal forest, including in those areas that are showing greening trend. This is mostly because of warming and disturbances. A lower resilience basically means a lower capacity to withstand further perturbations, and therefore a higher likelihood to cross the tipping point, and which could perhaps damp the expected increase of boreal forest productivity. So in order to better understand the vegetation changes and its impact on high latitude carbon sink, we need to consider the interactive processes of demographics and resilience, and move beyond the simplified static vegetation-climate relation. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yanlan. This is a fantastic talk. So any questions from the audience? Maybe while we're waiting for audience to type their questions into the live QA, I will start some questions from my side. So, for your first talk, you talk about the suitability model, right? So, and that suitability model you fitted in 1984 that doesn't hold anymore in 2014, right? And then you have to
Yeah.
revise your model. I'm trying to make try to understand this. So you try to revise your model, right? And then you extrapolate that model to look at what's going to happen in 2100, right? Because I mean, of course you use different models, but in the first the historical period, the model does not transfer over time. Do you think your revised model is going to transfer to or extrapolate well to 2100?
That's a good question. Thank you, Ying. So all I can say is it's more likely to be better than the old model where it only relies on climate in the sense that it can better capture the change between 1984 to 2014. But it's not to say that it's the perfect model that can be perfectly transferred to the end of the century. The point is that we compare this model with respect to the old climate-only model and see that the climate-only model can overpredict the shrub expansion and therefore carbon budget. So that's the difference that we are trying to zoom in rather than the overall predicted shrub expansion pattern at the end of the century. Yeah. So there are many other processes that we haven't considered. Definitely.
Yeah. Okay, great. A related question is that, say, your with your new model, that your analysis show that the fires can impact the can increase the expansion, shrub expansion, right? So,
Yeah.
but I wonder how the shrub expansion can impact fires. So there must be some interactions, right? So have you
Yeah.
looked at that yet, or is that already in your model?
Uh, Yes and no. Explicitly, no, it's not in the model. And indirectly, if there's a fire, shrubs are more likely to occur in that region. And then in the climate projections, basically, the fires are more likely to occur in areas where there is fuel. So whatever goes inside the climate model might be transferred here, but it's in a very indirect sense. So overall, I say it's a very weak link, and we are not explicitly considering the vegetation fire feedback. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we are still waiting for questions from the audience, but I'm curious if other speakers have questions to Yanlan's talk. Okay, we have a few questions here. Did you include in the model permafrost melt? This melting effect, the soil, and is a result of warming climate. How do you think this might affect the boreal forest resilience? So,
That's a good question. With this study, we don't know. We did not consider the impact of thawing permafrost, but essentially thawing permafrost will kind of release some moisture in the beginning of the growing season, but it also leads to more drainage at the end of the growing season and water loss. So there is kind of a trade-off there when the moisture becomes available for plants. My gut feeling is that if the permafrost thaws and deepens the active layer, and then it could promote the moisture stress at the end of the growing season. If we consider that, that might hurt the resilience as well. But for that, we will need further work to test that hypothesis. Thanks for the question.
yeah, thank you. We have more questions? Yes, okay. The next question is, do you think in your study, let me release the question. Do you think in your study area, there is likely social ecological interactions to promote the shrub expansion, such as farmland abandonment?
In that region, I have not seen a lot of farmland just because it's so remote in the high latitudes. But if there is a human-initiated fire that could promote shrub expansion, that's what I see in terms of human interaction. Yeah.
Okay. There are more questions, but because of time limit, I would like to make the executive decision to move to the next speaker. Yeah, thank you very much. This is a really, really fantastic talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Ying. Thanks, everyone.
So our next speaker is Professor Pierre Gentine from Columbia University. So Pierre is Maurice Edwin Lamar was a professor of geophysics in the Department of Earth and Environmental Engineering and Earth and Environmental Sciences at Columbia University. He studies the terrestrial water and carbon cycles and their changes with climate change. Pierre is a recipient of many awards, including the Early Career Awards from NSF, from NASA, and from DOE. He is also the AGU Global Environmental Change Early Career Award, and also the Massillon Medal, which is also equivalent to the AGU Fellow, and also AMS Messinger Award. Right now, he directs the NSF Science and Technology Center, STC, for learning the Earth with artificial intelligence and physics. This institute is called LEAP. So it's my honor to have Professor Pierre Gentine as our speaker here. So Pierre, the floor is yours.
Thanks, and thanks so much for the introduction, and especially after a great talk. Can you hear me fine, and can you see the slides just to make sure?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So today I wanted to talk about some work. I mean, some of that is from a few years ago, where we looked at compound soil and atmospheric dryness. So trying to look at when soil moisture and atmospheric dryness would actually have an impact on ecosystem productivity. And that's mostly work from Sha Zhu. She's actually now in Beijing Normal University. Julia Green, she's now a professor at University of Arizona, and Adam Messman, who just graduated last year. So just in terms of the introduction and how the talk will actually be unfolded, first we'll look at soil moisture and the impact it has on long-term and also interannual variability of the terrestrial carbon cycle. And then we'll be looking at what we call compound events. So the fact that typically when you have a drought, it doesn't really occur in isolation, but it tends to be happening at the same time with high vapor pressure deficit and higher temperature than usual. And we will show that basically this is very much due to land-atmosphere interactions and net atmosphere feedback. So when we look at the carbon cycle, especially looking at models here in particular, our projections of future carbon cycle, and that was actually very well explained in the previous talk, we know that there's a tremendous amount of uncertainties in terms of future carbon uptake across different models. And here, this is just showing kind of the projections of different carbon uptake from different models. And you can see that there's tremendous amount of models spread across the CMIP type models, especially over land. And in fact, for many of those models, we don't even know if they will act as a carbon source or even as a carbon sink. So we really need to kind of nail down those uncertainties and try to improve the representation of processes in those models. And we also know that the land is actually responsible for a lot of the internal variability in the carbon cycle, which we can actually also infer from actually atmospheric inversions. And this is just showing an example here, showing, for instance, that the ocean has a carbon sink that tend to be actually relatively smooth, but the land is really the one that's actually responsible for a lot of the variability that we actually are seeing in the atmosphere. And a lot of that is actually due to disturbances and droughts and extreme events, as we'll see in the future. So, but that's really critical. We actually need to also nail down those uncertainties and the variability that we have in the carbon cycle. And a few years back, actually, Julia Green, who was actually a PhD student in my lab, what we showed is that we can use some thought experiments. So we call that the glass experiment, where we can actually do some sort of denial experiment in soil moisture And the idea is to say we want to replace soil moisture with just the mean soil moisture without any type of trend or any type of droughts. So that's basically the green line that you see here. This is just a time series at one particular pixel. Or you could actually replace that with basically a slowly varying soil moisture that will have the right seasonal cycle, but that will actually follow also the trend. So that's actually what we call experiment B, the blue line that you see here. But those two experiments, the main point is that they are not seeing extremes. So they really just have a seasonal cycle, either with trend or without trend, but they don't really see the extremes. And so that's a great actually tool to look at the extremes and the impact of extremes and droughts in particular on land atmosphere feedback, on climate, but also in that case, we looked at the carbon cycle in particular. And what we could show is that we can actually decompose the impact of soil moisture in terms of soil moisture variability. So this short-term variability due to droughts in particular. And we can look at the impact of soil moisture trend in terms of the long-term carbon projections. And what we could find is that soil moisture variability tends to be very large and very important right now, but then in the future, because of some drying trends in some regions of the globe, soil moisture trends and this long-term drying can have an impact as well, which is of the same order of magnitude as the soil moisture variability. But taken together, soil moisture variability plus trend has a very large impact in terms of creating basically a carbon source to the atmosphere, which is almost as large as the carbon sink and the terrestrial carbon sink. So it means that we really need to nail that down and nail down the impact of soil moisture and basically dryness on carbon sink and the terrestrial carbon cycle. And we could get into the weeds, but why do we have an impact of soil moisture variability? The fact that it goes to negative and positive anomalies, because on average it's zero, it's really because we have nonlinear feedbacks, right? And because the processes are nonlinear. So even though we are actually varying across around the mean, we will have basically a carbon source because it takes basically many years to make up for one drought year. And that's also been shown at the global scale using observation, but looking at the interannual variability in that case, and where people have shown that basically a few extremes and a few extreme events dominate the global interannual variability, especially in GBP in that case, using an upscaling, that's the so-called FluxNet NTE product. And they could show that extremes can have a tremendous impact also on global productivity taken all together. So basically there's model evidence that this is really important, and also observational evidence that this interannual variability is really critical and can also have a very long-term impact in terms of the global terrestrial carbon cycle. And it seems, and there was this nice paper by Vincent Humphrey a couple of years back, that soil moisture, and in that particular case, they also used observations from GRACE satellite, which is basically looking at the terrestrial water cycle. And they could show that there was a very strong correlation with the amount of variability in the carbon cycle in the atmosphere. And basically that was a way to show that there was a very strong relationship between variability in the interannual variability in the carbon cycle as inferred from the atmosphere and inversions, and what we could have actually in terms of terrestrial water cycle. So it seems again that there's a tremendous impact of water cycle in the terrestrial ecosystems and its impact at the global scale. So all of that was actually global in terms of atmospheric impact, in terms of CO2 variability. So kind of the main question for this talk is, if we take that for granted, we could say that, okay, it seems that soil moisture is really the main driver of carbon cycle variability through that feedback, basically through the terrestrial carbon cycle that will then have an imprint in terms of the atmospheric variability. So, but maybe going back to some sort of physiology 101, we can really think of dryness as stressing plants in different ways. We have basically a water supply limitation, right? Do we have enough moisture in the soil? So basically at the root level that will actually propagate through the xylem and then making its way to the leaves. And then do we also stress the leaves and especially the stomata in terms of higher water demand, right? The fact that there might be some higher atmospheric dryness in terms of, say, vapor pressure deficit, so the difference in water vapor between the leaf level saturation point and the atmospheric water vapor. And then the question is, which one actually dominates, or is it a combination of those two? And we could really ask the question because at the end of the day, we are really dealing with the soil plant atmosphere continuum, and especially the xylem is creating that continuum in terms of the sap. And so there's really a relationship in terms of the stress that those two will actually create together and the impact that they will have on water potential and potential gradients within the plants. And there's been quite a bit of debate. So this is just basically one of the earlier paper from Kim, who's going to be next, actually, showing that there's been quite a bit of debate, and people have shown, like for instance, that paper from Kim, that vapor pressure deficit seems to be dominating. And then there was some debate, some more recent paper showing that maybe it could be soil moisture. In that particular case, they showed using eddy covariance towers that vapor pressure deficits seem to be having a tremendous impact in terms of canopy conductance, which is quite a direct way of looking at the amount of stress within the ecosystem. And they could show that VPD had a tremendous impact in terms of reducing conductance compared to soil moisture. One thing I would like to point out is that those sites on the left-hand side tend to be basically wetter than the one on the right-hand side. So that's the dryness index here. So there seems to be some sort of also nonlinear threshold, and we'll get back to this in a minute. So maybe when you're drier, you're more sensitive to soil moisture, and maybe when you're wetter, you might be less sensitive to soil moisture. And that's something to maybe keep in mind. So one of the issues is that we have a tremendous amount of coupling between soil moisture and VPD. And so the question is, did we really attribute the impact in terms of saying that a lot of that is due to either soil moisture or VPD? And we are actually missing the fact that there's very strong coupling between the two of them. And in fact, when we look at some eddy covariance tower data, we can show that there's actually very strong anti-correlation between vapor pressure deficit and soil moisture. And in fact, I don't know if you can still see my screen. Oh, I pressed the button because that was hiding the soil moisture. So can you still see my screen? Okay, thanks. So we have soil moisture here and VPD, and we can see that they are very strongly anti-correlated, as you can see here. So really, there's something inherent to the system that really makes a very strong anti-coupling, if you will, between soil moisture and VPD. So typically, when we are very wet, we tend to have very low VPD, and when we are very dry, we tend to have very high VPD. And you can see again, based on observations, and models are showing it the exact same. So it seems it's actually quite critical to, you could say maybe we don't care so much whether it's VPD or soil moisture, but that's actually important when we want to look forward into the future, because we know for sure that vapor pressure deficit is going to increase dramatically with climate change because of two reasons. The first one is that we have increased temperature, so there's going to be an exponential increase based on Clausius-Clapeyron vapor pressure deficit. And at the same time, we also know there's some nice work actually by Michael Byrne in particular, showing that relative humidity is actually dropping over continents as well because of some feedback also with ocean circulation as well. And soil moisture is actually not changing that much. If we look at least at simulations, we can show that soil moisture tends to be relatively steady across the globe, except in some specific regions, especially the Mediterranean, and basically the southwestern US, where we've been actually experiencing many wildfires. So why are soil moisture and VPD coupled? We could think of that basically because of land atmosphere feedback. And a lot of that is due to the fact that there's a very obvious reason for that. When we increase vapor pressure deficit, we increase basically the demand in the atmosphere, and therefore we will be drying up the soil, right? So more evaporation as long as there's enough moisture, and that's going to be dropping the amount of soil moisture. So there's a very obvious direct feedback of vapor pressure deficit on soil moisture. But there's also an indirect feedback, which is basically the fact that soil moisture, when it's actually dropping, is actually increasing sensible heat flux, right? So the amount of heat released into the atmosphere, and also reducing evapotranspiration because we are starting to get stress, right? And taken together, those two will actually basically increase vapor pressure deficit. And you could actually show that based on very simple atmospheric boundary layer budget. So that's an example I had like a while back, where we can actually track the amount of specific humidity or the amount of moisture in the atmosphere and the amount of temperature on the right-hand side. And we can show that as we reduce the evaporative fraction, which is very much almost the same as soil moisture, when we increase evaporative fraction, basically we will reduce the diurnal range of temperature, and we will also have a direct impact on specific humidity. We will increase the amount of moisture in the atmosphere, and the converse, right? So when soil moisture is lower, we would expect a much stronger diurnal temperature range, and we would also expect to basically dry up the atmospheric boundary layer. So taken together, when we reduce soil moisture, we will have a very strong increase in terms of vapor pressure deficit, especially due to this diurnal cycle. So we can actually test that, right, in models, and what is the impact of that, this two-way feedback, and we can actually shut down the feedback of soil moisture on the atmosphere, and that's again using this glacé experiment where we basically impose soil moisture, so there's no feedback in terms of land-atmosphere feedback. And what we can show is that without land-atmosphere feedback, we basically really shut down that coupling between VPD and soil moisture, right, as you would expect. So that's what is shown here on the left-hand side, as opposed to the case where we have this land-atmosphere feedback, where we can show that there's actually very strong coupling between the two of them. Very, very similar again to the observations that we just had at Fox Tower. So meaning that models really capture this coupling between soil moisture and VPD. And again, it's very important that basically most of the VPD increase is actually due also to this land atmosphere feedback. So it's not just climate change alone, it's actually a very strong impact of the land, which is directly having an imprint into the vapor pressure deficit. So the fact that the land might be drying from time to time, or that there might be droughts, will have a very strong impact on vapor pressure deficit. So, and that's actually one of the primary reasons why vapor pressure deficit is also increasing. So then we ask the question, so, okay, if that's true, it means that land atmosphere feedback seems to be really important. So we can potentially revisit the question as to whether soil moisture is really the primary driver of some of the variability we are seeing at the interannual timescale in terms of carbon cycle. So we just thought that maybe we'll revisit that paper from Vincent Humphrey that looked at observations and looked at basically the growth rate and the variability from year to year. And we thought, let's try to revisit that using a modeling approach where we try to actually remove any type of internal variability and try to remove any type of chance. And that's basically what we did here, where we have this control experiment where we basically have the feedback, the land atmosphere feedback, and then another one where we basically prescribe soil moisture and we don't have the anomalies, we don't have the droughts. And basically we could see kind of the same result that Vincent had earlier, is that most of the variability seems to be attributed to soil moisture, right? Somewhere it seems that we are basically shutting down the variability in the carbon cycle when we are actually prescribing soil moisture and when we don't have droughts. So it seems that really, even at the global scale, soil moisture has a tremendous impact in terms of the interannual variability. So confirming the observations that they had in terms of correlation, and here more at the process level. Now you could ask, is it really truly soil moisture directly, or will it be soil moisture through the vapor pressure deficit feedback? So we basically try to address that question by doing some sort of decomposition between just the direct soil moisture impact, because we have this decomposition between prescribing soil moisture or having interactive soil moisture. So we can do this denial or causal experiment. And we could show that we could actually have a very simple linear regression model, and that managed to actually capture this global model relatively well. We could do that pixel-wise, and we could actually then aggregate things. So the main idea was, let's try to actually look at some sort of attribution of the impact of either soil moisture or VPD, and let's decompose those feedbacks, because we have those counterfactual experiments, so we can use that and leverage them. And what we could show is that most of the variability we are seeing in terms of the global carbon cycle, which is here on the top, which is mostly, as you would expect, in transition regions where soil moisture can become dry and has some level of variability. So very similar to the original type of glacé experiment, where people have shown that those are transition regions that have the most impact in terms of climate feedback, but here also on the carbon cycle as well. We could show that the direct soil moisture impact is actually not as great as large as the VPD feedback, right? Through that decomposition and attribution. And we could show that, in fact, soil moisture tends to be drier, and at least in the model world, it seems that VPD, through that feedback on, tends to actually have a stronger impact in terms of the carbon cycle. So it's not directly soil moisture, but it's soil moisture through the feedback of VPD that has this tremendous impact on the carbon cycle. And of course, it's the combination of those two that will have, in the end, the impact in terms of internal variability. But it seems, at least based again on the model world, that the indirect soil moisture feedback on VPD is the dominating factor in terms of creating that variability from year to year on the carbon cycle. So just to wrap up, so you could ask, is that true? So is the model world correct? So we thought, let's try to look at that from an observation standpoint, right? And let's try to disentangle the effect of atmospheric demand, so VPD versus water supply, and water supply being either soil moisture or when we don't have observations of soil moisture or precipitation. And the trick we used was to use basically a space for time type of approach where we use basically fluorescence as a proxy for GPP. Happy to talk whether that's a good choice or not later on. And we try to use space for time as a way to basically decouple kind of the gradients we have in vapor pressure deficit and soil moisture, taking some clustered regions that have relatively similar type behavior and relatively similar type of ecosystem. So I'll show you two examples. So the first one was to look at the Amazon. So what we did is we looked at this basically nonlinear response of GPP or fluorescence to precipitation, so water supply, and to VPD. And what we could show is that, in fact, the most positive contribution is actually in those dry regions where we know that soil moisture should have a positive influence actually on fluorescence and also on photosynthesis as well. And we could show that in wet regions, we could see that there was a very strong impact of so strong negative impact of VPD on ecosystem. But in dry regions, we could see actually this very strong contribution of VPD, which seemed to be, in that particular case, dominating again soil moisture again in that particular context. And that seems to be opposite to some of the models, right, that tend to be kind of showing too strong a response in the Amazon, so in wet regions. So maybe something to correct, where they seem to be overly like doing the response to vapor pressure deficit, but they seem to be more in agreement in terms of the transitional regions, which are the ones really driving this internal variability that we talked about before. And you could actually relate that, this gradient between the wet and the dry regions, again, to a water supply threshold. So it seems again that things tend to be very nonlinear, right? When we are on the right-hand side here, it means that we have high precipitation. So this is just a clustering of those data points. And here we have high vapor pressure deficit where we are on the top. And we could show that basically the response that we will have in terms of response of photosynthesis to precipitation or to VPD very much depends whether we are in a wet or a dry regime. And in the dry regime, that's basically what we could show is that VPD seems to be dominating to some extent, at least in those observations. We could also show that in Europe, and we could show looking at different types of extremes, a very, very extreme drought as opposed to a regular type of drought, which is more of a heat wave. And what we could show is that same type of behavior where we could show that VPD had a strong impact most of the time, you know, on GPP. So that's the slope we are seeing here. But we could show that when things were actually very dry, drier than usual, which is basically in 2014 to 2018. So this is at Flux Tower site. We could show that, in fact, the slope of GPP to soil moisture would change dramatically. So again, what this is pointing to is the fact that it's a very threshold-like behavior, a very nonlinear behavior, where most of the time VPD basically dominates. But when soil moisture is very dry, that might be actually the dominant factor. So we need to take those pictures at the top with caution. So soil moisture might not be dominating on average, but sometimes when it's very dry, will be the dominant factor. That's kind of the key message. So just to wrap up, soil moisture has a large impact on long-term carbon cycle and the interannual carbon cycle as well. And it's not just soil moisture, it's actually soil moisture, but also it's indirect feedback on vapor pressure deficit. And we should really think of droughts as compound events. So typically when we have a low soil moisture component, we will always have a high, or most of the time we will have a high vapor pressure deficit component as well. And again, through land atmosphere interactions and land atmosphere feedback. And those are actually really critical to look at the internal carbon cycle. And I would like to emphasize that nonlinearity is really critical, especially for soil moisture, right? So the VPD response tend to be relatively similar across regimes, but the soil moisture response, as you would expect based on first principle, tends to be very, very much like a threshold. So it tends to actually lead to very, very nonlinear type behavior. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Really, really is amazing talk and insightful takeaways here. So, well, we're waiting for questions from the audience. I'll kick off the Q&A here. So I wonder, like you show in the very later stage, you show the nonlinearity of soil moisture. So it's really under extreme dry conditions, soil moisture would play the dominant role, but VPD will be probably more common regardless of the environmental conditions. So I wonder if there is any threshold of like beyond which the soil moisture the role of soil moisture will be exponentially increase or substantially increase, and how, if so, if there is such a threshold, how such a threshold would change in space, say how that changes with PFT and other factors.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. So in fact, we have a collaboration with Fu Zheng and Philippe Xia looking exactly at those things, where you could actually map out this critical threshold, and you can actually use very nicely satellite observations to actually infer this threshold. And you're right, I mean, it's very dependent on PFT, but also I would even say on ecoregions as well. But I think now we have kind of the capacity to really look at this threshold, and you can really see this type of behavior, right, before and after. And again, when we say soil moisture is more or less important, it's also when, right? I think the question is also really critical is, most of the time, soil moisture is pretty irrelevant, you could say, at least in transitional regions. But, there are times when it's actually very, very critical. So I think when we look at this kind of battle between VPD and soil moisture, the timing is also very critical. Yeah, that's a very good question.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm curious because I have been working with data for so long, and also I have been working with model for so long. So I wonder, I want to learn your perspective, like how the uncertainties in data. For example, we don't really have high fidelity soil moisture data, right? Of course, we have a lot of satellite data there and also reanalysis. But none of those data are satisfactory to like the point that we would desire, right? So how those data uncertainties can impact the interpretation of these results?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say, actually, I love the recent soil moisture data, especially SMAP. It's really beautiful. I mean, people could argue that, so there are two issues, I would say. The first one is in high biomass regions, right? Where we know that, there could be a very large amount of uncertainty. And that's why we didn't use soil moisture in the tropical rainforest. We use precipitation instead, because I mean, the soil moisture signal is just too polluted because of the amount of biomass. So that's a very good point that you have. But otherwise, I would say it's surprisingly good in many ways, especially SMAP. And in fact, there was a recent paper that was very interesting showing that people typically thought that it would only basically observe the top 5 centimeters of the soil. But it happens to be that it actually observes more in a sense, because when you're very dry, the microwave signal can penetrate deeper into the soil just because you have less moisture. And then luckily as well, when you're very wet, it's very hydraulically connected. So for very different physical reasons, you can actually see an e-folding depth, which is actually much larger than 5 centimeters, which makes it potentially very relevant for like plant level understanding. So it's almost, like within a lot of the ruling depth, like 10 to 20 centimeters. So that's kind of nice, So maybe I feel we underestimated the capacity of those sensors to really be used to address like ecosystem or questions.
Sure. Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives. So we have a question from Kim Novick here. Kim can't post the question in the QA session, the QA that box. So Kim, do you want me to read your question or you want to ask Pierre directly? Well, if I can't hear Kim, so probably I'll read Kim's question. Oh, okay, sure.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear. Hey, Kim.
All right. Hi, Pierre. Thanks for the nice talk. I definitely totally agree, based on your results and others, that there's this, clear threshold-like response to soil moisture. But I'd just be curious to hear you opine a little bit about how much of that apparently threshold type behavior really depends on the metrics we use to describe soil water status. So soil moisture versus soil water potential, or perhaps, shallow versus deep soil moisture.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and we've talked about that. Yeah, no, I very much agree. In fact, there's been some nice work also showing that if you were to transform that into water potential, things would be even more how can I say, would be collapsing into things that are even more predictable in a sense. So yes, you're right. We observe some moisture. Ideally, especially for stress, we would want to have some moisture. That's true for photosynthesis. If we wanted to look at some other things like evaporation, maybe some moisture is also one thing you would want to have. So I think it depends also on what you're really after. But for that particular case, yeah, water potential would be great. The issue will be, of course, like how do you get from water potential and some moisture? So we tried pretty hard, and oftentimes you get into like a lot of uncertainties in terms of retention curves, etc. So it becomes pretty, pretty nasty sometimes. And then your second question about ruining depths, I would say yes. Again, that was my earlier comment. I mean, we only observe the topsoil layer. Is that the one that plants are really seeing? I would say there are cases where it's definitely not the case, and we actually have a paper we are about to submit on that with Sonia Snigaratne as well, showing that when you have very strong groundwater convergence, you're right. I mean, there's very strong decoupling between the two, between what you observe in terms of soil moisture and what plants would actually be seeing. And that will have a tremendous impact on the carbon cycle. And I kind of feel we are underestimating the impact of groundwater. So.
Thank you, Pierre. So Rong has a question. So can you put Rong onto the stage?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for wonderful talk. I have a question about how VPD affect the GPP or plants in addition to influence it through, let's say, transpiration or ET. The reason I'm asking this question is, these drought index tend to be based on soil moisture. But when you look at the dry areas such as Western US, the VPD or PET is far larger than ET. And therefore, its impact is not just through increase of ET. So I wonder whether you could comment on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think VPD can have an impact first, as I mentioned, like on drying up the soil, right? And it can, and people could even debate, like, is it really VPD or not, or is it something else? I mean, there was debate as well in terms of, is it relative humidity? And it's also more complex how plants are being stressed, there might be like some hormones as well. So things that might be more soils, yes. So I think it's still pretty open, I would say, like what is really causing the all of that stress, and there are multiple, it's typically multi-components.
Yeah, thanks. I also wonder to what extent it's really the temperature impact, because VPD has temperature and humidity.
Yeah, we looked into that, and we tried to be very systematic at decomposing them. For temperature, you really see a parabolic response. Typically, that's what we see. But for VPD, you see this exponential. So I think you can decompose the two, especially using relative humidity as a way to decouple those two.
I see. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So we have 2 more questions from the chat window, but due to time limit, I would like to move to next speaker, but I'm going to release these 2 questions to the QA session. So Pierre, if you don't mind, can you type your answers?
Sure, sounds great. Thanks so much.
Release these questions. Yeah, thank you so much. So our next speaker is Professor Kim Novick. Kim is a professor and Paul O'Neill Chair in the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. Kim studies how climate variability impacts carbon uptake, water use, and energy cycling in terrestrial ecosystems, and the complementary processes by which ecosystems determining the pace of climate change. Kim has been serving in the leadership capacity to multiple climate networks, including AmeriFlux, FluxNet, NEON, and the USGS Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And Kim was also a recipient of the Early Career Award from AGU for, the biological science sections and also global environmental change sections. So it's my great honor to have Professor Kim Novick. So Kim, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Looks like you can see my screen and hear me. So fantastic. So So this talk's going to be a little bit different. This is really going to be kind of a forward-looking perspective on strategies that we can implement really at the federal level to ensure that the rate at which we are generating information underlying the scientific basis of nature-based climate solutions is matching the pace at which these strategies are actually being implemented on the ground. And the source of what I'm going to share really comes from two places. The first is a white paper report that we released last fall, following on from a workshop we held on the same theme last summer. And I really want to acknowledge the writing team for that white paper report, which was large, and it was a major effort. But I really learned a lot from all of these co-authors, and I hope to, fairly represent their views over the next 19 minutes or so. The other source is a paper that's currently under review that's really specifically targeting some policy opportunities and federal investment opportunities that are being discussed in DC right now. So let's first start by just defining nature-based climate solutions. There's a few ways that you could do that, but here I'm going to describe them as purposeful interventions in ecosystems that are designed to slow the pace of climate change through three possible mechanisms. The first is increasing the rate at which CO2 is sequestered and stored, through photosynthesis, where that storage can happen in plant biomass or in the soil. The second are interventions designed to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, for example, from the soil, including CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. And then a third, probably less appreciated mechanism is interventions that might brighten the land surface, raise the albedo, such that more incident solar radiation is reflected right back out into space instead of being absorbed into the climate system. And I think it's most helpful. There's a few ways you can categorize these strategies. I really like categorizing them by the type of biome in which they can be implemented. So we have a variety of strategies that could be, used in forested landscapes and working lands, which include croplands and pasture lands, and then also wetlands. It's really important to recognize that these are not the solution to climate change. The solution to climate change is rapid economy-wide decarbonization. And we should not even be talking about nature-based climate solutions unless that is happening. However, given that we are dramatically reducing and eventually eliminating our anthropogenic emissions of CO2, there is consensus that these nature-based strategies can provide important near-term mitigation. And it's also definitely important to note that many of these strategies have well-established, proven environmental co-benefits for biodiversity, for water quality, for air quality, and soil health. And I think it's also important to note that many of these strategies are restorative. And, especially in the eastern United States, before we made a big mess of the climate system, we made a big mess of the land with dramatic and terrible consequences for the people that used to be the stewards of those landscapes. And that these, the ways that we degraded our soils and the rampant amount of deforestation that happened in the late 19th century are problems that are very much connected to the climate change problem. Okay. So if there are three things I want you to remember today, it's that first, so far, implementation of nature-based climate solutions, at least in the United States, has outpaced the science necessary to understand when and where these strategies can actually succeed. But we have the data and tools to address this gap. And for a variety of reasons, right now is a great time to start doing that. So towards the first point, it's been dramatic to watch how quickly interest in nature-based climate solutions has grown over the past few years. They receive broad bipartisan support at both federal and local scales of government. They are strongly supported by many conservation-oriented NGOs due to their co-benefits, among other things. And there's a fair amount of buy-in from the private sector and also, farmers and foresters and the agencies that represent them. Within the last year or so alone, we've seen $20 billion allocated for the implementation of so-called climate-smart agricultural practices through the Inflation Reduction Act, in addition to another $3 billion allocated again for implementation of a wider range of climate-smart strategies through the USDA. We've also seen over the past few years a dramatic increase in the number of carbon offset credits sold in voluntary and compliance carbon markets. Now, the truth is a range of policy mechanisms could be used to implement these strategies. You could probably imagine some that should be on this list but aren't. But the truth is, so far, implementation has largely occurred through carbon market systems. And to say that this has been problematic is actually to dramatically understate what we've seen happening. The truth is that the protocols for monitoring, reporting, and verifying the realized benefits of these projects in these offset markets are very diverse and non-standardized from one entity to the next, and they are non-operable. And many of them rely on decades-old tools that were not necessarily designed for the purpose of verifying carbon benefits of ecosystem interventions. And as a result, we've seen many reports of offset sales that were not additional or that even backfired. Imagine a reforestation project that goes up in flames 10 years later due to wildfire. And so there's been a lot of recent literature highlighting a lot of problems with the carbon market systems. And certainly, I think it's a great time to be thinking about not only how could market systems be improved, but also are there other strategies that might engender more credible and durable climate benefits. Okay. How much additional mitigation can be accomplished with nature-based climate solutions is very much an open question. This is a figure from a study published by Connor Nolan and co-authors a couple of years ago, where they basically went through the literature and found 42 papers that provided a global scale estimate of the total mitigation potential that we could achieve if we, broadly motivated the use of nature-based climate solutions. And then they just presented those potential estimates in rank order. And the point is that they're all over the place, right? With the highest being well over an order of magnitude bigger than the lowest. Some of these strategies say that nature-based solutions can provide us with enough negative emissions to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, while others suggest that we fall short. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but we don't know what it is yet. There's also quite a bit of uncertainty on the usefulness of specific individual nature-based climate solution strategies. Here is a figure from a paper published by Joe Fargione and colleagues in 2018 that focuses just on the United States and categorizes the mitigation potential sort of as a function of the price of carbon. And we can see that, reforestation comes out on top if carbon prices are very high, but when they are low, as they are today, it's actually cover crops that appear to have the highest mitigation potential. I could say a lot about cover crops. I think this is all I'm going to say today. But you have to. What's striking about this figure to me is the size of the error bars, which are often as large as the estimate of the mitigation potential itself. And if you really dig in and figure out how are papers like these, generating these estimates, the underlying data basis is really kind of shaky. So this study from Poplow and Don, which was published in 2015, is widely used to estimate the mitigation potential of cover crops. I don't doubt that the pulling together the information in this figure here was a tremendous amount of work. It's something like 120 studies that observed the soil carbon benefit associated with cover cropping. But as you can see, most of those studies focus on very short-term benefits, and we really lack data on the longer-term changes in soil carbon. Of these studies, I think something like 20 or 30 were from the United States, which is really the focus of my talk here. So certainly we are quite data limited, particularly when it comes to these strategies that can be implemented in working lands. Okay. So if we take a step back for a second, as we did in the white paper, one of the first things we did is sort of imagine what are some key criteria that we would associate with successful, right, and credible and robust nature-based climate solution strategies. And the first is that they should lead to ecosystem scale enhancements to carbon uptake or reductions of non-CO2 greenhouse gases that are additional and measurably additional to what would have occurred without the intervention. Next, they should lead to net cooling, right? So for example, that, an albedo effect that's adverse, right? A darkening of the albedo does not overwhelm any benefits associated with carbon uptake or greenhouse gas emissions. They should lead to a durable benefits by accounting for both environmental and social risks to permanence. And they should account for leakage so that gains in one area are not simply represented as losses somewhere else. And the next thing we did in the white paper was identify some knowledge gaps that prevent us from knowing when those criteria can be met. And we are scientists, or at least most of the co-authors were scientists, and we are very good at identifying problems. And we came up with a long list of them, as you can see here. And, I certainly don't have time to talk about all of them. I am going to dig into one theme for just a couple minutes. But I do want to mention that by and large, we view these as solvable challenges, information gaps that could be confronted over relatively short timeframes. Some of them as quickly as a year or two, and others it might take a few years, but we have the data and tools necessary to begin to close these gaps. What I really want to talk about for just a minute is a set of knowledge gaps that relate to the fact that our focus historically has been on a relatively limited set of carbon pools. So most of what we know about the potential of these strategies comes from estimates of changes in 2 carbon stocks. In agricultural lands, this is the amount of soil carbon stored in usually the top 20 or 30 centimeters of the soil, which we can measure by going out, taking some cores, analyzing the carbon content, going back a few years later, doing the same thing, and taking the difference. In forests, our focus tends to be on biomass, and in particular above ground biomass and the carbon contained therein, which we estimate by making measurements of tree structure like diameter and height, and then using those to force allometric models, which are empirical schemes that were developed largely from trees that were harvested decades ago, and thus probably do not account for the effects of CO2 fertilization and other climate feedbacks on allocation and tree structural relationships. Okay. The truth is that those 2 carbon pools are important, and those measurements have some value. They're familiar and they're relatively easy to do, at least in theory. But because as Yanlan and Pierre showed us, because land carbon cycling is such an important control on the interannual variability of atmospheric CO2, we have over the years developed such a wide set of tools that can be used to understand ecosystem carbon cycling. These include flux towers, which are pretty near and dear to my heart. They're kind of the bread and butter of my research program. But for those of you that are unfamiliar, you can think of these as really fancy meteorological stations that are capable of measuring at every half hour the ecosystem scale exchange of CO2 and also methane and sometimes nitrous oxide between ecosystems in the atmosphere. So really valuable tools for understanding variability in ecosystem carbon uptake. We also have a growing set of really exciting remote sensing products that can provide us not only information on vegetation structure, but also vegetation function with SIF and platforms like EcoStress. And many of these data are now aggregated into national and continental scale networks. All right, so a lot of what we're trying to do is just make sure that we're using all of the tools at our disposal to reduce uncertainty around nature-based climate solutions. Okay, I have to be honest that the flux towers alone are not the solution to the problem, because while they have many, there are many things they do well. They see these fluxes at the ecosystem scale. They can detect albedo impacts, and they have a really low latency in terms of their ability to detect how an intervention affects carbon cycling. There are other things that they can't do that well. They can't exactly tell us where allocation is going, and if lateral losses due to harvest or runoff are large, those need to be otherwise accounted for because flux towers can't see them. So really, the most robust approaches would probably blend information from flux towers and remote sensing products together with these more traditional stock-based measurements. But just to show you why we might want to do such a thing, this is a figure that was published a couple of years ago by Aaron Tietz. He's a PhD student, or at least he was at the time, at Northern Arizona University. And what you see here is from 6 Ameriflux sites in the United States. On the x-axis is the tower estimated annual carbon uptake, and on the y-axis is an estimate of the same flux, but based on application of allometric models with those tree structural measurements, right? So, the point is that this does not look great. There's a very weak relationship across all the sites, but even within a site, there is not great agreement between what the towers tell us and what we learn from DBH measurements. The tree structure inventories tend to miss the extremes. They tend to really work within a much narrower range of carbon uptake. There are some better agreements if we sort of average across all the site years, which is encouraging. But the point is that the tools that we traditionally use to estimate carbon uptake in forests agree quite poorly with what we see from the towers. The tower data themselves aren't perfect, and I think there's just a lot of work to do to understand what are the sources of this disagreement, and how can we leverage information from flux towers and satellites to help us better understand interannual variability in our on-the-ground monitoring schemes. Okay. And so one way that we might do this, we can imagine a network of gold standard data sets where, in particular sites, and particularly in paired sites where we have a conventionally managed site and one managed with a nature-based climate solution strategy, we really sort of throw the book at it. We do the traditional stock-based accounting. We have flux towers. We measure the lateral losses. We do near-surface remote sensing. And we make these data, of course, freely and openly available to all who are interested in using it, and that we should consider leveraging the vast amount of existing infrastructure supported by networks like NEON and Ameriflux, at least in the United States, and then globally, of course, we have FluxNet and ICOS and some others. We can't do this everywhere. This is very expensive, but if we did it well in some places, and again, made those data freely and openly available, information like this would be tremendously useful for assessing biases between stock and flux-based accounting approaches, for understanding missing mechanisms. For example, does a change in soil carbon under cover cropping really reflect an increase in inputs in terms of atmospheric CO2 sequestration, or simply a decrease in outputs and lateral flows? These data would also be quite useful for model benchmarking and remote sensing product validation, as well as evaluating the protocols that are used within market systems to quantify the benefits of individual projects. Okay. So right now we have a really great opportunity to begin to close some of these knowledge gaps. This summer, the USDA released a federal draft federal strategy to advance greenhouse gas emissions measurement and monitoring in the land sector. And this document proposes to do a lot, but importantly, it rests on a foundation of a $300 million, item in the IRA Act to build a research network like this. Okay, I think there's one figure in the document, but it is encouraging to see that it begins with a focus on basic science and research, moving along to the generation of survey and remote sensing data, which we can then incorporate into models and tools, which we can then incorporate into strategies for emissions estimates and assessments at a wide variety of scales. And there's a lot to like in this document. It proposes a new national soil carbon monitoring network, which is certainly long overdue, a rather loosely defined agricultural greenhouse gas research network, and improve accessibility and representativeness of sort of the implementation of conservation or climate-friendly management practices on the ground, and sustained and enhanced strategies for both ground and spaceborne monitoring of forest biomass. However, there are also probably there's certainly a few opportunities to strengthen the draft federal strategy, which is the topic of this paper that's under review. First, it is so important that the data generated through this initiative be open and accessible to all interested parties, university scientists, NGOs, and the private sector, and that they be, by accessible, we mean that it should be straightforward and easy to access this information. We propose that the sort of research network vision in this strategy would be stronger if we considered a hierarchical network of networks approach that aimed at creating things like those gold standard data sets I just described, whereby we leverage existing tower infrastructure from Ameriflux and NEON, and consider doing things like co-locating FIA plots or plots from this new soil carbon monitoring network within or near the footprint of these towers. And we also see opportunities for better large area mapping of forest disturbances and management activities, coupled with a strategy for relatively rapid quantification of the carbon cycle impacts of these disturbances. Okay, so I'm about done. But once again, the main message here is that implementation of nature-based climate solutions is right now outpacing its underlying scientific basis. But we have the tools and data to address this gap, thanks to decades of research into ecosystem carbon cycling in general. And with this draft federal strategy, it's really a great time to think about how we can best do that. All right, so thank you. And if there's time, I'll be happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kim. This is a very, very forward-looking, visionary overview. So while waiting for questions from the audience, I will start my questions. So the first one is that the first criteria is like ecosystem scale enhancement over the baseline. But I wonder, do we have a credible assessment of the baseline yet? Do we know the baseline yet? So that we can better understand, okay, are we going to have enhancement?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you know, the baseline, baselining is a critical component of these strategies, and it is an extensive section of the white paper. I'll try to put the white paper link in the chat. You know, the truth is, when you think about baseline, I really think about it in two ways. The first is sort of, what do we know about the biophysics, right, of the land surface right now, right? And then how will that change in the future, in a dynamic future with dynamic climate feedbacks? And I think that we have tools to quantify that with more certainty than is probably used in the existing market-based monitoring programs or measurement programs. Particularly if we use the full set of tools at our disposal. You know, the other part of the baseline is a little bit more philosophical, I think, which is trying to understand the decisions that individual landowners are going to make, right? Which factors in, and that's way outside of my wheelhouse. I'm not qualified to talk about that, though. It is an important consideration. Would this farmer have implemented cover crops without participation in this particular incentivization program? Those are really hard questions to answer, but I do think it makes it clear that we as physical scientists need to be reaching out to our colleagues in social science and when we're thinking about studying these topics, because the social factors are also a huge source of uncertainty, and we could do a whole nother talk about those.
Yeah, thank you. I'm asking this because we recently have a USDA funded proposal called AI Climate, which is trying to use AI to find climate solutions from forest and also agriculture sectors. So which in many ways are highly relevant to what you are talking about. So maybe you can have a separate talk about that. Okay,
that
so
great.
Yes. And Rong has a question. Can Jody put Rong on the stage?
Yeah. Hi, Kim. Thank you so much for this really, to me, it's a very, very interesting and eye-open presentation. And I have a question. In these solution, we experience extreme events pretty frequently, and every time we have a major drought, you got carbon sink, a carbon source from ecosystem become a carbon source. So in these mitigation, not mitigation, it's a carbon uptaking vision. How is there any plan to identify the climate regime or area that is more suitable for uptaking carbon, whereas avoid the area where you're unlikely to the ecosystem is unlikely to be able to take carbon.
Yeah, it's a great question. The third criteria we identified related to what you just talked about, which is durability, but I didn't have much time to talk about it in more detail. And when I think about durability, in forests, the environmental risks to durability are so important. So droughts and wildfires and insect outbreaks can have, dramatic consequences for the carbon storage in forest ecosystems. And just, as a note, in working lands, here, I think the social factors that determine durability are really poorly understood and very important, right? Because it's so easy for these landowners to reverse, or change decisions about how they manage the land. if we think about forests, it's on the one hand, we saw from Pierre's talk that it's very hard to predict future carbon uptake. We're not that good at it yet. So it becomes challenging to think about, well, how do we predict future carbon uptake of these forests that we might allow to rerow today? But on the other hand, we do know some things. I mean, we can take use statistical approaches to understand where the risks of these environmental threats are greatest. And, Billy Andre's done a lot of great work on that theme. And it's funny, if you look at the results, at least for the United States, the Western United States lights up as kind of a bad place to think that your, forest-based climate solutions will lead to durable benefits, whereas in the more music Eastern United States, the picture is a little bit more encouraging. So, until we solve the grand, challenge that many of us have been working on for decades, which is better models of ecosystem carbon uptake, I think that we know enough to know where these strategies are likely to be relatively more durable or not.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So there is one question from Pierre. So Jody, can you put Pierre on the stage? In the meantime, I saw hands up from attendee Ben Oswald. I don't know if we can put you onto the stage, but can you put your question into the chat window? Thank you. So Jody, is Pierre on the stage now?
Yeah, can you hear?
Yeah.
Hey Kim, great talk. Yeah, very, very interesting. I had a kind of a twofold question, because I've been always kind of wondering about the impact of soil carbon, right? Because that's kind of the big unknown that, and I think you kind of showed some of that when you looked at above ground biomass and dentometers versus, carbon uptake from flowers. And kind of related to that, a fear I have also for some natural solutions is age, right? Because oftentimes, people just take an estimate over a couple of years, but of course, as the forest grows, the carbon uptake is way lower. There's way more respiration. So we'd love to hear your thoughts here.
Yeah, great questions. Yeah, soil carbon. I mean, I didn't really on that figure that I showed. I mean, another point of it is that the tower estimates are biased high compared to the allometric estimates, and we could think of a few reasons why that's the case. Tower data aren't perfect, but also those allometric relationships are not considering changes in soil carbon, and so we need better strategies for monitoring, in particular, forest soil carbon, which is not part of FIA, for example. In terms of age, now that's a question after my own heart, Pierre, because, Odom's hypothesis is, sort of motivated a lot of the research that we've done. I think that the door is wide open to revisit those what we think we know about how forest carbon uptake changes with stand age. And, I'd be happy to chat more offline. But we have tools now that can help us address that question in ways that have not historically been possible. The theory is decades old. And what I think is most likely the case is that the time scale is not quite right, sort of in the papers published in 1969, due largely to climate feedbacks like CO2 fertilization. But I think there's a lot of work to do in better constraining how forest carbon uptake changes with age.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Finally, we have one question from the audience. How much do the estimates from nature-based climate solution effectiveness and the proposed policy, including reduction in fossil fuel combustion?
Okay.
Ben,
I'm gonna assume that you mean sort of related to the implementation of those particular activities, right? So if you're going to use enhanced mineral weathering, right? Application of silica rock to enhance carbon uptake, there is a emissions cost because you got to get all the rock to the place, something like that. And in that case, I have to say that the carbon market protocols, actually, they're in there. Whether or not I'm not qualified to address the accuracy with which those, probably emission factors or something like that, do the job, but they are at least considered in many of the market protocols, and it's probably something that our field could stand to think about a little bit more when we are working outside of those contexts. Great question.
Thank you. We still have more questions from attendee. Javid are, but for some reason, audience said complain that there are issues posting their questions into the live QA session. So Jody, can you help on that? But in the meantime, we have to push to the next presentation. Thank you so much, Kim.
Bye-bye.
So our next speaker is Professor Rong Fu. Rong was actually my postdoc advisor, so it was really good to have her back. So Rong is a professor in Department of Atmospheric and Ocean Science, and also the director of the Joint Institute of Regional Earth System Science and Engineering in University of California, Los Angeles. Her research focuses on mechanisms that control droughts, rainfall seasonality, and variability over Amazonia and also North American regions. She received many awards, including the NSF Career Awards and the NASA New Investigator Awards, and the AMS Outstanding Achievement Awards for Biometeorology. She is also a fellow of AMS, AGU, and also AAAS. She was the president of Global Environmental Change Section and the leadership team of AGU Council and the chair of the AAAS Atmosphere and also Hydrosphere. And she's the AGU Council member and the AAAS Council member serving on its executive committee in 2023. Rong also co-led NOAA's Drought Task Force 4 and is editor of journal, GGR Atmosphere, and also the editor of the Climate Change section, the third edition of the Encyclopedia of Atmospheric Sciences. So Rong, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for such a long bio. I apologize for that.
No, that's all your achievement, and I'd love to introduce that.
Next time I'll provide. Oh, okay. How do I share? Are you able to? Yeah, I did that. Oh, okay. Are you able to see? No. Yeah. Oh, okay. And then should I? Okay. Let's see, where is it? I did all of those, and for some reason it didn't show up. Let me close others. Sorry about this. You're still not able to see, huh? Huh. Yeah, let me do that one more time. Okay. Oh, okay. I should click on the PPT, right? And then the entire screen. That's probably. Yeah, let me find. Let me find the bring this forward. Sorry about this. The entire screen. Yeah, I clicked that, but it doesn't show. Mike. Oh, okay. I can. You have my PowerPoint, right? You. But it wasn't successful when I did the speaker session. Let me try one more time. Sorry about this technical. Why it doesn't show up?
I have the slides, but who can I send this email to? Okay, but I'm also on Mac. Okay, so let's see.
Oh, let me see. I might be. Okay. Oh, let me see one more time. Are you able to see? Let me see if I close down all of them. I'm having too many. Are you able to see mine? No. Yesterday when I tried it, it worked. Entire screen. Share to, let me try one more time. Oh, should I?
It works. How about this? Can you see it? Yeah, I'm on Mac.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about this technical challenge. If I do this, let me see. No. Can I do set? One more time, I try. Entire screen. I can still not working. Okay. Okay. Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. And first of all, thank you, Ying and the organization committee for giving me this opportunity to learn from the session, especially the presentation of other panel. I really enjoyed it, learned a lot. And my presentation really focused on the tropical terrestrial ecosystem. And I'm going to mainly focus on how describe how climate has changed, has impacted the temperature and precipitation, and including VPD over tropical continent, and how that have affected the ecosystem. I like to acknowledge Alex Chen, Sarah Warden, they're my PhD student. The result I presented here are theirs. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So here I would like to show that it's obvious that global biomass burning, global biomass is very much connected to precipitation. So you can see that globally, the heaviest rainfall are located over tropical continent, and then they're corresponding to very high biomass. It's not so obvious how temperature linked to this when you just glance at the map. And in fact, if you look very closely, the surface air temperature over these tropical forests, where the highest biomass is actually somewhat lower than the less vegetated area, and even lower than surrounding ocean. except where you have upwelling, ocean upwelling that cause cooler temperature. So my main point of this presentation is really to emphasize, focus on the impact of warming on tropical ecosystem, mainly because it has received less attention. Next slide, please. So how has climate change in the overtropical continent? So here are mainly Amazon and the Congo basins. And the warming, surprisingly, the warming over tropical land, these whitest part of the global land, is actually faster than global average. For example, over Amazon, the temperature has increased about 1.2 compared to pre-industry area. That's higher than global average. And I'm not showing here, but since 1993, Congo, actually temperature over Congo basin has shown strongest trend among the tropical area. And there's, but if you look at the precipitation, the change in the trend is not significant, perhaps, except perhaps in the southeast of Amazon. But because of an increase of temperature, precipitation minus evapotranspiration, P minus PET, has shown significant decreasing trend over Congo and to some degree over the southern Amazon. Next slide. So if we look at the median, very, very frequently we see report on flood, drought over Amazon. And I just used two pictures as example. As we speak now, Amazon is experiencing yet another worst drought. And you can see this photo in October 2023. And not too long ago, we also see a lot of report on flood. But if you look at the time series of the flood, which is showed on the left, lower left corner, the blue curve on the top, that is a time series of flood since 1900. You do see very frequent flood events as marked by the year of the flood. And if you look at the middle curve, red curve, you do see drought, and 2005, 2010, 2015 drought really received a lot of attention. However, when you look at comparing these flood and the drought to the last 120 years, and they have not really exceed the range of natural variability. And we actually don't have a clear way to say that we don't have a very clear way to attribute these variation to climate change yet. And another factor I would like to point out is these drought and increase of rainfall, decrease of rainfall, they're happened in different part of the Amazon and different seasons. For example, increase of rainfall mainly occurred during the March, April, May, and mainly concentrated on northern part of Amazon, whereas decrease of rainfall mainly occurred during the boreal fall, September to November, and they're mainly concentrated over southern Amazon. Next slide. And while changing slide, I want to mention actually over the Congo, the increase of ET has really changed the relationship between precipitation drought and river runoff drought, hydrological drought. So we had a really fantastic discussion on importance of VPD on ecosystem in the previous talk. And so here I would like to discuss the increase of VPD over the Amazon. And So we are using the 2023 drought as an example, and this is yet another record drought when you look at the river discharge. But if you look at the precipitation deficits, and they are not that strong except in the northern end of South American continent. But when you look at the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, SPEI, and the drought are very severe. And this basically highlight the contribution, the impact of increased evaporative demand. The question is what caused this increase of evaporative demand? Pierre has a really great discussion on the processes and also so I think, and also previous talk. So I think in here, in this paper by Hodina, I have a hard time to pronounce her name. They use a CMIP5 simulation to attribute the cause of the increased VPD over Amazon. So what they found is only over northwestern Amazon, where increased VPD trend was relatively mild, you can attribute this trend to increase of greenhouse gases and the biomass burning aerosol. Whereas over southeast of Amazon, where the VPD trend is the strongest, and they think the main cause is actually reduce the moisture and the rainfall due to natural variability. However, we know that the climate model has quite a strong bias over, it's very challenging to simulate a hydrological cycle over Amazon. And so the question is whether we could use alternative attribution approach to understand the underlying cause of this VPD. Next slide. So here I like to show ongoing work of my student Alex Chen. So here we use this observational-based analog attribution approach. So the idea behind this analog is the natural climate variability, such as ENSO, PDO, ANO, they mainly affect the VPD through the anomalous atmospheric circulation. So therefore, we can actually identify atmospheric circulation pattern and look at what kind of VPD we should expect based on these anomalous atmospheric circulation pattern. And we can determine this by looking at, say, daily circulation pattern and their associated VPD in the past. And then we can estimate their mean, their range of variability. And so that's an analog showed in the red line in the top left panel on the left. And so compare that with the observation. The difference here is the residual here is the VPD changing that cannot be explained by circulation anomalies. And what I want to point out is in this case, actually the land atmosphere feedback associated with the normal natural variability or atmospheric circulation change variation is included in the analog. So what you can see here is roughly before 2000, the observed VPD and analog VPD are pretty close, meaning most of the observed VPD variation can be explained by natural variability, by atmospheric circulation anomalies. But since 2000, and you see the gap between observed VPD and analog VPD increase very strongly. And this part is meaning VPD has increased far beyond what we can explain by the natural weather pattern change, atmosphere, and the climate variability. In fact, the natural climate variability only contribute 35% of these increase of APD, whereas the other 65% are mainly due to changing the thermodynamic condition and primarily warming, temperature warming, and that is what we would expect from anthropogenic forcing. And if we look at the number of VPD, number of the days when VPD exceed its natural variability, and we also see quite a clear increase, and since about 2005. So this all suggests that the increase of VPD over Southeast Amazon is actually mainly due to climate change. Next slide. Another change in that's clear, even the precipitation, annual precipitation change is still within the range of natural variability. We don't detect significant change, but the dry season length has been increased significantly. This happened in both Southern Amazon, as you can see to the left, and also Congo Basin, as you can see to the right side. So the increase of dry season length over Amazon is mainly caused by delay of the dry season ending or wet season onset, whereas over Congo, the increase of dry season length is mainly due to early onset of the dry season. Next slide. So what caused the lengthening of the dry season? So over Amazon, there are more study over Amazon than Congo. So over Amazon, the take-home message is the trend is primarily climate change and land use, whereas the variability is mainly connected to the natural mode of climate variability. So more in detail, if you see the top right panel, where we look at the wet season onset associated with the key thermodynamic condition and the dynamic condition. So here, the horizontal axis, convective inhibition energy is same. It represents thermodynamic instability in the lower troposphere, mainly boundary layer. So if you have a warmer, drier surface and during the dry season, which we saw as indicated by VPD, and the convective inhibition energy is higher, so that tend to suppress the occurrence of a deep convection that delays wet season onset. The dynamic condition central for wet season onset is really these cold front. They coming from southern hemisphere extratropics, and as they push into tropics, they lift these humid, moist air and leading to onset. So these cold front, the equatorial incursion of cold front is usually connected to the subtropical jet in South America. So if jet is more poleward, you tend to have a late onset. If jet is equatorward, you tend to have early onset. So the poleward shift of jet is also an indication. The trend is expected from climate change, especially during the boreal summer, and where the interannual variability can be connected to ENSO. So as you can see here, the delayed onset from 70 to the first decade of 21st century is mainly due to increase of dry and warm land surface over during the dry season, and also the poleward shift of tropical jet. And there are other studies connect this variation to global warming mode of a sea surface temperature, narrowing the rising motion of Hadley cell, and of course, to some extent, the Atlantic multi-decadal variation. And I want to highlight the importance of land use. And so here, these are data analysis by Philo in Brazil, where they really comparing the dry wet season onset between deforested area and forested area, and found the delay of the onset actually increases with deforestation. Other land use effects include biomass burning, aerosol, reinforced surface high pressure over South America. So there's a multiple line of evidence, and most of them can be connected to climate change. And although natural variability also affect these delay of the onset over South America. Next slide. So over Congo, so far the delay, the early onset of dry season is mainly connected to warming of Indian Ocean and La Nina-like sea surface temperature anomalies in the tropical Pacific. So we don't have we cannot really attribute. We don't have a clear connection. We don't have a clear evidence this is due to climate change yet. And one important, I think land use probably is also very important for the lengthening of the dry season, mainly because ET over Congo, actually, ET over Congo is even greater source of moisture for the atmosphere for rainfall than Amazon, and there's the increase of land use increase is pretty fast over Congo. Okay. Oh, sorry. Next slide. I'm trying to speed up. What's my time?
Since we started this 10 minutes late, so maybe
yeah,
5 more minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just quickly say. So what I want to say here is, you can hit another. Hit one more. What I want to say is the transition between rainforest and savanna is not only dependent on annual rainfall, but also depend on dry season length. So far, we haven't detected significant change of annual rainfall associated with climate change. However, the increase of dry season length is clear. So that means the area, the rainforest located in the area where dry season length is pretty marginal for rainforests that are most vulnerable. And in fact, if we look at the biomass changing based on the radar signal, and we can actually see quite a strong loss of biomass over Southeast Amazon, where the dry season length is very marginal for sustained rainforest. So we also see quite a widespread of reduced dryness or reduced biomass over Congo. Next slide. And here the resiliency of rainforest also decreased. And the first speaker, Yanlan, had a great description of this resiliency, basically the autocorrelation of annual biomass. As you can see here, that the Southeast Amazon, the rainforest lost resiliency, and their result of, if you look at the right panel, their combination of result of a strong drought and also increase of land use. Next slide. So what I want to say here is both the southern Amazon and Congo is located in the climate regime that is very, it's unstable for the biome transition between forest and the savanna. And I think the evidence we see and also the increased dry season length and their impact on ecosystem might suggest that this kind of transition is already begin. And next slide. That's final. So take home message is really here the increase of the temperature and its contribution to increase of VPD seem to represent the major impact of climate change on ecosystem, because they really the increased VPD is mainly is an important cause of increasing dry season length, or at least over Amazon, to some extent probably Congo. And the land use effect here is also a significant factor, but perhaps will be become increasingly important. And because of this change in the warming during dry season and associated increased VPD, and then lengthening dry season, the tropical rainforest has already shown sign of vulnerability and loss of resiliency. I think these changes are consistent with what we expected for the climate impact occurred over Amazon and Congo. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ron, for speeding up. Yeah, really, really great talk, as always. Again, I'm going to kick off the question while waiting for others. So it's very interesting to show like the dry season lengths are getting longer for both Congo and Amazon, of course, due to different reasons. I wonder, do Amazon and Congo have differences in terms of their resilience? Or if so, are such differences related to the mechanisms, whether it's due to the late onset in Congo versus the late ending in Amazon? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think perhaps there's two aspects of resiliency. One is how resilient water cycle is to climate change. The other is how resilient ecosystem is. I'm not an ecologist, so I'm not in a good position to comment on resiliency of the ecosystem. But I think in terms of a water cycle, this is a very preliminary, there's some preliminary evidence and that Congo, the water cycle over Congo might be more resilient than Amazon. In part, really because of the geology, because Congo basin, there's very little runoff. Most of the rainfall actually stay in the Congo. As a result, if you have a large annual variation of the rainfall, the response, I think it doesn't, so basically you have a much bigger reservoir, they're more resilient to annual variation of rainfall. Whereas Amazon, half of the rainfall goes to runoff. So if you have annual variation, you do see that. In terms of ecosystem resilience, I'm not so sure because Congo, most of the Congo has two rainy seasons. So the dry season is relatively short, and that may imply these rainforests may not be, they didn't have a chance to adapt for increase of dry season. But on the other hand, dry season is low. We do see in some year the spring wet season is missing. If the spring wet season is especially sensitive to ET, so if you so that's where we also see early onset for dry season. So that if there's a vulnerability of water cycle, that might be where you would expect vulnerability, and that their impact on Congo rainforest. I probably should not. I don't have any evidence, but I would guess it's going to be strong.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we have your one question from the QA. I saw from the slide that the drought in October 2023, the 3 months SPEI by SPI figures are current data. How can you compare with beginning data taken from 1978 to 2016? Would you explain it clearly? So I'll try to post that question to the release that question. Can you see that?
I can't, but from what I hear is because I use the 3 months SPI or SPEI, how can I connect that to the?
That's all good.
Is that a question?
No, it was not Dave's question, but Dave was probably asking something else. Dave, we'll move to you in a few seconds. So, Ron, yeah, so the question is that how do you compare your data, the beginning data taken from 1987 to 2016? Sorry, I'm not sure if I understand this question.
Yeah, in terms of SPI or
SPEI and also SPI.
Okay. How do I compare that with 2023 with data in 1979?
Actually, to be honest, I'm not sure.
I'm not so sure
this question, but I released it to the QA session. If you can see that, maybe you can read it again and type your answer there.
Yeah.
But we can have Dave on the stage if you don't mind. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, could you clarify the question?
Okay.
Dave?
No, Dave didn't have a question.
Okay.
So I will try to post the question to our presenter mode here so that Ron, you can answer that.
Where
it's on the presenter chat.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. I saw in terms of a contribution of difference between SPI and SPI, is that what this question is at? For example, in the early day, like 2005, and the SPEI and the precipitation contribution is much larger than ET. As a result, the drought severity represented by SPI and SPEI are much closer to each other. Whereas in the this current drought, because warming has and the increase of PET has such a big contribution, so the drought severity represented by SPEI is far more intense than the drought than SPEI.
Okay, yeah, great. Thank you so much, Ron. So our last speaker is Dr. Dave Schimel from JPL. So we will conclude our session by the plenary presentation by Dave. Dave is a senior research scientist at NASA JPL, and he's also the group supervisor for the Carbon and Ecosystem Group at JPL. Dave serves as the mission scientist for NASA's planned mission SBG. His career has focused on large-scale impact of land management and climate change on ecosystem processes and on the role of global carbon cycle in the climate system. His expertise includes managing large, complex research projects, remote sensing, data management, modeling, and the application of ecological research to science policy development. He is an expert in optical remote sensing with experience.
Could you say that again? Sorry, I didn't catch it. I had to mute.
Sorry, Dave, I was just introducing you. Oh, okay. So Dave is an expert in remote sensing. For example, NASA's MODIS instrument, imaging spectroscopy and thermal imaging, as well as spaceborne and airborne LiDAR. He is experienced in data simulation and application of advanced data science to complex Earth science problems. Dave served as a CEO of NEON from 2006 to 2011, and he oversees the NEON's design and development phase to successful completion. He also served as a senior scientist at UNCAR's Climate and Global Dynamic Division for 20 years, and he's a founding director of the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry in Jena, Germany. Dave is one of the recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in 2007 on the IPCC climate change report, and he is a fellow of AGU and the ESA and the Ecology Institute of Germany. He has co-authored more than 200 papers on biogeochemistry, climate impacts on ecosystems, and global carbon cycle. He was the editor-in-chief of ecological applications for the ESA and is currently the editorial board for AGU Advance. So, Dave, welcome. Thank you for this plenary presentation you offered. The floor is yours. Please go ahead to share your screen.
Like that. All right, thank you, everybody. It's always awkward talking to my own computer screen and not seeing the audience, but I'll carry on. I'm going to talk about the global carbon cycle and feedbacks between the global carbon cycle and the climate system in the post-Paris world. For decades, really, carbon and climate scientists have been imagining, thinking about what the world might look like as we proceed with climate change. We've focused a lot of our attention on the feedbacks and consequences associated with rising carbon dioxide. But if the world is successful in achieving a Paris Agreement-like outcome, where in the next few decades, we actually stabilize carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and even perhaps see them begin to decline, we're going to go through a series of major transitions. And while we certainly want to go through those transitions to stabilize and then reduce greenhouse gases, leading to a more equitable climate, we're now starting to recognize that there are a whole series of changes and transitions that are going to occur as a result of that we really don't know very much about. And just in general, today's scientists have only seen the world with rapidly rising carbon dioxide and warming temperatures. And our models are tuned and calibrated. Our understanding from field studies, from eddy covariance, from remote sensing, all tells us about the world with rapidly increasing greenhouse gases and warming temperatures, as well as the other much more complicated climate changes that the previous speaker, that my colleague Rong just talked about. So a lot of empirical experience or reason to believe that our models are correctly calibrated for the transition from increasing CO2 to stabilizing and then perhaps declining CO2. First, I want to frame a little bit the way we think about managing the carbon cycle at the broadest scale. Now, this is a graph of the temperature increase, that's the dark line on the diagonal, as a function of accumulated emissions. And for a variety of reasons, models simulate this relationship between accumulated emissions and the overall temperature increase as being roughly linear, although there's good reason to believe that there could be nonlinear discontinuities in this relationship in the future. And what this relationship allows you to do is it allows you to say, how much carbon can we release, or how many greenhouse gases can we release to the atmosphere while still achieving any given target, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, or some other number. And that's the total amount of carbon that we can release while remaining under or at that target. And the only way that we have of estimating that budget is by using models, because a significant fraction, in the present at least, of anthropogenic emissions are taken up by the oceans and terrestrial ecosystems, some by natural processes and others, of course, in managed ecosystems, as Kim Novick spoke about. And there's quite a bit of uncertainty about that budget, particularly as we move from rapidly increasing emissions to stabilizing emissions, because there's a good deal about those feedbacks, the interplay between the effects of carbon dioxide on photosynthesis and air-sea gas exchange, together with the impacts of a changing climate on photosynthesis, respiration, disturbance such as wildfire, and counterpart processes, heat waves, and circulation changes in the oceans. So we have a real policy reason for wanting to understand future feedbacks. Now, as you go up this relationship, you're following emissions. And it's very important to know what emissions are, where they are, and how they're being mitigated. But it's also really important to know how much of those emissions, the fraction of those emissions that remains in the atmosphere, because that tells us something about how much carbon we can actually release without breaking a climate target. These are some typical simulations from Earth system models showing in the different primary colors 4 scenarios of emissions. One that leads to declining emissions, and others that lead to sort of continually increasing emissions. And this is the global carbon flux into the land and the oceans. And so you can see from the central tendencies of these scenarios the effect of the different emission levels, driving either continually increasing concentrations and uptake, or leading eventually to declining uptake. So we have different scenarios, but feedbacks tell us how confident we are about the climate that any given scenario of emissions will produce, because different Earth system models take up different amounts of carbon into the land and the oceans as a result of increasing carbon dioxide and changing climate. And the range of climate outcomes for any given scenario is almost as big or as big as the difference between scenarios. So our uncertainty and our poor modeling, or our very divergent modeling of climate feedbacks, is a major barrier to understanding the relationship between an emission reduction policy and a climate outcome. We've been studying the carbon cycle for a long time. This is the figure from the first IPCC assessment. And you can see on the right-hand side a series of these figures from successive IPCC assessments. And we tend to show these figures as static. We talk about the carbon budget, but they're very dynamic. And this is one way of looking at it. So these are carbon budgets in the first 2 columns for the 1960 to 1970 decade, the first full decade with the Keeling record in place, and then the same fluxes from 2012 to 2021, more or less what we see today. And you can see that emissions, fossil fuel plus cement, more than tripled. The land sink more than doubled. Land use change actually went down a little bit, while the ocean sink almost tripled. The atmospheric growth rate went, as a result, from about 1.7 petagrams a year to about 5 petagrams a year. So dramatic changes. And accompanying these changes was a modest change in the airborne fraction. That is an increase in the fraction of fossil and cement and land use CO2 that remains in the atmosphere. And that is the outcome of all these feedbacks that we worry about so much, that eventually more and more of the anthropogenic emissions will remain in the atmosphere. Now, until fairly recently, we didn't really have good ways of, with confidence, partitioning these budgets between different parts of the world. And the first step in understanding feedbacks and interactions is to know where those feedbacks and interactions are occurring. The dynamics that go on in the tropics, we just heard about them in detail, are very different from what's going on in the northern hemisphere, where we have in the mid-latitudes forests that are largely recovering from historic land use, even afforestation. And in the boreal forest, we have complex dynamics associated with warming, permafrost thaw and breakdown, and a wide range of other processes. So these are partitioning of the fluxes from the traditional global carbon budget using mostly satellite data. So this includes assimilation or estimation of sources and sinks in a complex assimilation model that takes in a wide variety of satellite and non-satellite inputs. And so the first row is pretty straightforward. You can see most of the fossil and cement emissions are still in the northern hemisphere, a little bit in the tropics, and very little in the southern hemisphere. The land sink is much more complicated to think about, because from space, we see the net land sink, which is the superposition of natural uptake and release on fluxes associated with deforestation, land use, and land cover change. So this estimate from space shows that most of the net ecosystem exchange, net biome exchange, really combining disturbance with photosynthesis and respiration, is now in the northern hemisphere, with only a little bit in the tropics. But if you look at the next row, you can see that there's a large source from deforestation in the tropics that does not show up in the sink, right? We see only a very small sink. What that means is that there are large sinks in the tropics that are nearly or slightly overbalancing the emissions from land use. And from this, we can get a sense of how big the uptake balancing land use emissions might be. And from the oceans, we see something that confirms what we know from theory, models, and observations, that the sinks of CO2 in the oceans tend to be at high northern and southern latitudes. And this is all based on observations of atmospheric greenhouse gases, tracers of wildfire, and direct observations of biomass change over time using radar and LIDAR. One thing to point out is that terrestrial uptake has increased more or less in lockstep with increasing atmospheric CO2. And this is very, very strong evidence for a strong effect of carbon dioxide on photosynthesis, something that you know, if you look at this figure going back really to the origins of ecology as a science around the turn of the last century, the previous last century, our whole ecological discipline has been developed while atmospheric CO2 has been increasing. And so we really only know about stable CO2 from the paleo record and from models. And I raise that as a caution. We really don't know how good our model-based understanding is. But our observation-based understanding is quite flawed by sampling bias. Most of us do our research relatively near to our home institutions, and the vast majority of research universities are in the mid-latitudes. This plot shows photosynthesis and carbon storage from satellite-based observations by comparison to the distribution of FluxNet sites circa about 5 years ago. And you can see that most of the FluxNet sites are just exactly where they don't need to be. They're in the relatively low storage, low flux parts of the world. And so it's no surprise that our understanding of tropical and boreal forests isn't as good as our understanding of mid-latitude forests. We simply don't have the same magnitude or duration of time series research effort in those areas. But let's look now at our ability to gather data from space. We can develop maps, and these are images from analyses of the orbiting carbon observatory's greenhouse gas retrievals assimilated into a flux system for the upper panel. Those are terrestrial net biome exchanges, similar to the ones that I showed in the previous table. And on the bottom, the same air-sea gas exchange estimated in an ocean assimilation model using a wide range of satellite data. So we have the ability to make more and more measurements from space to better and better constrain our understanding of how the oceans and the land biosphere will respond to the global environment. But I want to point out that there are some very tricky aspects to this. You know, I showed you one view of our sampling density. Here's another way of plotting in spatial resolution and temporal resolution. And so you can see in the lower left that eddy covariance samples about a square kilometer with half-hour resolution. Inversions from the global CO2 network are pretty much global, with perhaps hemispheric resolution, and resolve seasonal to interannual timescales. Fluxes from satellite inversion might achieve about a 500 kilometer spatial resolution, and they're also reliable on seasonal to interannual timescales. Soil carbon is the big loser. Each soil pit samples about a meter maybe, and is able to capture decadal changes. Here's another way, though, of looking at the array of satellite measurements that are emerging versus 3 critical in situ observations. And so I've plotted on the vertical axis the total fraction of the global land area that is covered, and on the horizontal axis, the duration or the time scale that's captured by these observations. So, you know, our long eddy covariance records are 20 or a few years longer than that, and they cover about 0.003, that is to say 3/1000ths of the Earth's land surface. Forest inventories have been going for 50 or more years, and they capture about 0.003 of the Earth's land surface, or about 0.3%. Soil carbon plots cover a vanishingly small scale fraction of the Earth's land surface, and they really characterize decadal changes. By contrast, Satellite observations vary in the duration of the record. The left-hand cluster are mostly the Landsat and MODIS AVHRR records, which are pretty much global. They cover most of the Earth's land surface, and the records range from 5 or 10 years out to the Landsat record at a few decades. Greenhouse gas emission inventories cover most of the past century, as does information about land use, land cover change from Landsat. So you can see when you look at these three different ways of thinking about how we sample the world, that these different observations are very differently scaled, and yet we need to learn how to use them together to characterize the world globally, which we need to do for the carbon cycle. It's not helpful to have a perfect understanding over 0.003% of the Earth's land surface, given how heterogeneous the world is. So what do Earth system models say, and do we believe them? Most models predict sustained uptake of carbon into very warm climates, including soil carbon storage. They predict that the positive effects of increasing CO2 will remain larger than the negative impacts of warmer and drier climates far into the future. By contrast, in situ airborne and satellite measurements are showing very rapid deleterious changes to ecosystem carbon storage. And in general, to the extent that one can compare, model sensitivities seem to be inconsistent with the bulk of experimental and observational data. These are some model results showing for a 1% per year increase in CO2, which is sort of a benchmark, model runs that include both CO2 direct effects, that is CO2 fertilization and changing air-sea gas exchange, and climate. Simulations where only the effects of CO2 on photosynthesis and air-sea gas exchange are included, and simulations where only climate changes, but from the point of view of the land and the ocean, CO2 remains the same. And what you can see from these simulations is a very strong CO2 effect and a comparable or somewhat weaker climate effect. And this is what gets mixed and matched in all of these different models. And so, do we believe going into a post-Paris world that we know how the CO2 effect will work? And do we really think that the climate effect is slow and gradual, given that we're already seeing really brutal impacts of changing drought, temperature, and other climate impacts on terrestrial carbon storage? One thing I want to point out, there are two classic papers from the 1990s, one from Chris Field's group, another from John Taylor and John Lloyd, that have stepped back and looked at how CO2 fertilization works in a very fundamental sort of a way. And these are two key equations from each of those papers, a simpler form that doesn't include a direct CO2 effect, but simply talks about R, the rate of change in photosynthesis, and a more fully realized analysis from Taylor and Lloyd. In both of these simulations, in the upper one, you can see that as the rate of increase in GPP goes to zero, the rate of carbon storage will go to zero, because GPP times zero is zero. And that effect will occur with a time scale tau associated with the lifetime of live and dead biomass. And when you look at the more fully worked out Taylor and Lloyd version, you'll see exactly the same dynamic, that when the rate of change of CO2 in the atmosphere goes to zero, the rate of change of carbon storage with respect to time will also go to zero, with a time lag again associated with a tau that we typically take to be around 40 years. So let's think about what that means from the point of view of a post-Paris world. In a post-Paris world, we'll be at 1.5 to 2.5 degrees above our current temperature. And we may have pushed photosynthesis, even in C4 ecosystems, over its thermal maximum. We'll also see, we're already seeing lots of wildfire and rapid release of CO2 back to the atmosphere. But the effect of CO2 fertilization is going to go away. So the major driver of sinks in the present and recent past has been CO2 fertilization. But as the rate of GPP slows and goes to zero, eventually the mass of respiring biomass will catch up with that, and we'll see that CO2 driven sink. Even though photosynthesis and productivity will remain high, the effect of that on carbon storage will go to zero. But the effect of climate will not go to zero, because we'll still be adjusting, probably for 100 or more years. We'll still be adjusting to a warmer, drier, and more extreme climate. And so we'll be having to manage ecosystems very aggressively in a post-Paris world in order to maintain the carbon stocks that we have, and optimistically, as Kim Novick talked about, perhaps increase some of them. My own personal view of natural climate solutions going into the mid-century is that, honestly, with our best management strategies, we'll be lucky to hang on to the carbon that we have now. And the thought that we might actually dramatically increase carbon storage in a hot, dry, extreme, and fire-prone climate is perhaps wishful thinking. But we will have a very wide range of tools to monitor and manage resilience and adaptation, including a wide range of space-based sensors and increasing in situ networks that we need to learn how to use synergistically together. So in a post-Paris world, the main driving force for land and ocean sinks will slow and then stop, while climate feedbacks, elevated respiration, drought impacts on GPP wildfire will continue. Not a pretty picture. Managing stocks to retain existing carbon, much less increasing carbon storage, will require active and creative management. But as many government officials have said, you can't manage what you can't measure or model in a predictive sense. And we now have better and better tools for both measuring and ongoing monitoring of what's actually happening, and for using those data to improve models so that we can make less noisy and divergent projections of what might happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dave, for this very both forward-looking and also with historical view of this talk. I learned a lot. So, while we're waiting for questions from the audience, I have a question. So, I would like to take the equations you have, although it says 2 minutes left, but I think we can still remain here. So according to those equations, right, if the R or beta that increase is getting smaller and smaller, eventually to zero, and we don't know when it's going to get to zero. But when we look at the residence time, so if we can if we have lengthening residence time, then the product of the R, the increase rate, and also residence time can still increase, right? So from the measurement perspective, which term can we better to tackle? Or do you have optimism of that the product of those two terms are going to be, more optimistic than just looking at R?
So I think that we absolutely need to understand changing residence times better. We can make some inferences about residence time by assimilating flux and stock information into a model. We've done that with the cardamom model that runs at JPL. But we need better ways of constraining residence times in live and non-living organic matter better than we have now. So radiocarbon inventories are absolutely crucial for doing that. But we also need better process level understanding of when the residence time of carbon might go up or down. You know, in general, we expect with warming temperatures, live and non-living organic matter turnover times should go down. That is, the respiration should go up and fire will go up. But under arid conditions, it's less clear. There are possibilities that residence time could go up. I think the most interesting area, though, is in managing ecosystems to increase residence time. So managing soil carbon, managing forests, to increase the length of time for which carbon is stored in the biosphere. There are also a number of interesting and frankly quite scary approaches to increasing carbon residence time in marine ecosystems and coastal zones. But I've always thought residence time was where a lot of ecology happens, but it's much easier to measure photosynthesis than it is to measure residence time or soil carbon changes.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing your insights. And Ron said it's a very inspiring talk, and Ron would like to have a question. So can someone put Ron onto the stage?
Dave, thank you so much. It is truly inspiring.
Hi, Ron. I feel like I should come and sit in your office for this.
Yes, we should do that, definitely. I think it's very inspiring. I have a question. I agree with you that we'll be very, I mean, our first goal should be maintain, right? At least maintain the carbon storage. But in some areas, such as Western US, seems the climate change, these extreme events, it's already on the way, and kind of trend left station is kind of hard to, you can manage it, you can mitigate, but the trend is there. But in other area, maybe there are great potentials to maintain or increase carbon storage in the soil, in the biomass. So the satellite, this observation, the capability of quantify the carbon storage and also understand what control them could be a really great asset for identify this area where we can actually increase carbon. Do you think that is possible? I mean,
so I think, I'm very enthusiastic about ecosystem management for climate mitigation.
Mm.
I think that there are many regions of the world that are desertifying already, where we're going to have to work really hard, but we may be able to maintain or even increase carbon storage. There are still large areas in the mid latitudes where historically forests have grown that have been converted to agriculture or urbanized and are now lightly used. So there's certainly areas in Europe, North America, and China where afforestation or reforestation could be very, very successful. And there are any number of ways in which agricultural lands can be managed to maintain or increase carbon storage while generally promoting soil health at the same time. And I think all of these avenues, they're all win-win solutions. That is, maintaining healthy ecosystems has many other benefits as well. And so I think they all need to be embraced and effectively monitored for maintaining resilience. On the other hand, I don't think that we can count on ecosystem management for an increasing and large share of greenhouse gas mitigation.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Great. Thank you for your great question, Ron. So Kim has a question. So can someone put Kim onto the stage?
Okay. Hi, Dave.
Howdy, Kim.
There's an echo. Shucks. Hope it's tolerable. Great talk. Give me just a second. Okay, can you all still hear me? Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I can't hear you, but I do have a question. But first, a comment, Dave. I can't remember the last time you were in Indiana, but I do notice a bit of a split in terms of, let's say, enthusiasm around natural climate solutions between those that live in the Western United States and those that live in the Eastern United States. So if it has been some time, open invitation to come. We'll set you up to give a seminar, and then we can drive around all the unproductive, marginally productive croplands and pasture lands that were forest 150 years ago. And the music.
Kim, I want to be really clear.
But my question is,
yeah.
And I had to mute so that the echo would stop, and I'll unmute you on my end in just a second. But my question is, I've just been thinking a little bit lately about how hard it is to measure carbon from space, carbon fluxes and carbon stocks. SIF and some other tools tell us some information about GPP, but the net flux is hard. It seems like we are much better at measuring water fluxes and perhaps water pools. And I just wonder if you think that we are leveraging data on the water cycle to the fullest extent possible to inform our understanding of the carbon cycle and remote sensing analysis, but perhaps also modeling contexts.
So let me just respond first to your comment. So I'm a huge enthusiast for natural climate solutions. But I think that while we're doing that, we're balancing losses in other systems. So in a global sense, it may be a wash, it may be a sink, it may just be that we reduce sources. But there are certainly areas, especially in the mid-latitudes, where we can store a lot more carbon. As far as measuring from space being hard, all of these measurements are hard. But they're getting better, and a huge effort is being extended to improve them, including for water. I would not necessarily say that the water measurement is better than the carbon measurement. I would say it's different. So we measure, for example, evapotranspiration by local energy balance closure using land surface temperature and albedo. And it isn't less uncertain than the CO2 flux, but it's at a 60 to 100 meter spatial resolution. So it has very different characteristics, and we can do a lot more spatial averaging to reduce the random error for ET than we can for NBE. The various constraints on GPP are also at relatively high spatial resolution. And so they're really good to use with the ET or with canopy water content, other measures of ecosystem water stress. And we produce now a water use efficiency product that seems, reasonably well correlated with similar measurements from eddy covariance towers, which have their own warts. So I think that the point of my time-space plots was to show that all of our different approaches to measuring carbon and water fluxes have, if you will, complementary strengths and weaknesses, and they're all better together than being used separately or independently I would never want to rely only on space-based measurements, and upscaling to the whole globe from 500 or 600 eddy covariance towers also brings in a huge sampling error that the space-based measurement doesn't have, while each of those sites' local error is probably much smaller than the space-based comparable estimate. So, you know, I think we have growing networks and more space-based capability, and we need to use them effectively to simultaneously address accuracy and precision, but also sampling error and sampling bias.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kim, and thank you very much, Dave. We have a technical question from the audience, who is asking, the phase experiments are showing a saturation CO2 fertilization effect. The equation you shows consider that experimental evidence?
Well, so phase studies don't all uniformly show saturation, but remember they're all at doubled CO2 and at either constant sort of present day slowly increasing CO2 or at a high constant level that might emulate 2100. And so yes, these equations should capture the dynamics in a phase site. There are a lot of other things going on in the phase experiments, including stand age and nutrient limitation. But the basic idea that as biomass increases, respiration and soil mass increases, respiration will increase. In principle, a phase experiment would allow you to estimate part of that tau term. If that's true, then that tau should be very, very short, because in 1 or 2 decades, many of the eddy covariance studies seem to have been at saturation. On the other hand, I really want to point out something that's very unfortunate, which is it's hard to measure net biome exchange in an eddy covariance, in a phase experiment. It's easy to measure biomass increment. It's tricky to measure soil change because it's so noisy. And you can measure photosynthetic changes, but there's not, until you cut it down at the end of the experiment, there's not really a great constraint on total carbon storage in the same way that you get from eddy covariance or space-based flux measurements. So it's really hard to compare the experiment to the data that we get from observations.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dave. So we are running a little bit over time, but I think it's worth it. I would like to thank all the 5 distinguished speakers again for their truly inspiring talks, and I learned a lot. And again, thank you very much. So lastly, I would like to announce that we are going to have the last session on Earth system effect of carbon dioxide removal, chaired by Kirsten Ziegfeld. If you are willing to join that session, that would be great. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you again, Dave, Rong, Pierre, Kim, and Yanlan.